Okay, so we're wrapping up today, our last class. So I wanted to start with just a quick review of what we talked about at the start of the semester. And then I want to pivot to talking about kind of where we are with disasters. And then if we have time, we always run out. There's always more we could talk about in this class. But if we have time, I'm going to ask you guys if there's a topic that in particular we didn't cover that you guys really wanted to, that I can speak to and just sort of answer some of your questions about that if we have time. But again, want to turn us back to the start of our class, and remember that we call a disaster occurs when we have a hazard that is impacting us, right? And when that hazard impacts us in a bad way, in a significant way, we refer to that as a disaster. We mentioned that we have a thick disaster bureaucracy. The current administration is doing everything they can to destroy the bureaucracy and our ability to respond to disasters, unfortunately. We didn't talk much about the World Health Organization in this class this year, but I just wanted to pause here for a second and say this is an important component. So this is the World Health Organization, which we were up until January 20th, the largest contributor to in terms of funding, but also in terms of data and other things compared to most of the rest of the world. I do not know where we stand now. We may no longer be, and in fact, I think we are no longer the largest contributors. Certainly by next year. I don't know how much we committed in the first part of January and stuff, but certainly the current administration's goal is to basically not fund this important global public health entity. But suffice it to say, they have the classic sort of UN bureaucratic terms of how we define these terms. But we said for our class, and I think for you going forward, the useful breakdown is really an emergency is where when this thing impacts you or your family or your house or your little immediate places where you work. A disaster is where we're impacting multiple places, a neighborhood, many families, many folks, stuff like that. And then a catastrophe is when that expands to a much larger region, so the whole city or the whole county or state or something like that. So I think that's the most useful term, emergency, disaster, catastrophe. We talked about different things. We talked about sort of acts of God and all that kind of stuff. We mentioned how the Sendai framework is something that we use that I use in this class when I talk to you guys about disasters. I gave you guys some readings on this, but we didn't look super in depth in it. But suffice to say, we hit some of these things that we refer to as disasters. A lot of them fall into the meteorological stuff, droughts and storms and stuff like that. We asked about, do we associate disasters with certain things, et cetera. And we talked about, we started the semester off by talking about the sort of birth of modern disaster planning and sort of bringing modern thinking to these disasters. And recall that came from this barge that was up in Nova Scotia, up in Canada, and it blew up, right? And it blew up, and it unfortunately, hurt a bunch of folks. And in the wake of that, one of the responders said, "Man, I think we can do this better." And so, he basically went to school and went to Columbia, which is now unclear what's happening with Columbia, given that they've how do I say this? Given that they have decided to partner with the current administration, and then in so doing, their reward was to say, now you're not going to get any funding. So it's unclear if you could still do this in Columbia. I think they're not taking new graduate students at this point. But back in the day, when we had an open Columbia and dynamic intellectual landscapes, the key thing there is we merge the social stuff with the physical stuff, right? With the social sciences with the natural sciences. That's what we do in ESRM. But this was very unusual. It still is somewhat unusual, but it was very unusual back then, and that really helped our modern kick off the modern approach to disaster management. Now, we listed several of these things, only a few of these that we really talk about, but basically we have all of these deals. And as we'll see in a moment, yes, all disasters matter. If they happen to you, they're quite significant. Totally get that. But we really have policy changes. We really have big management responses when it is a large disaster. That's really what keys in people to thinking, oh my gosh, can we change our approach? Can we do something different, et cetera? And we talked about this cycle. And some people have a finer division of this, but the basic idea, though, is it's never ending, right? It's one of these continuous loop things. And so we start off with, well, usually we talk about starting off with mitigation, right? We can say that. So mitigation is sort of the large scale approach that we're taking to this. So not building near the river, right? Having fire codes and things like that, so that we're not using flammable roof materials or stuff like that, so that we reduce the likelihood of this disaster being able to harm us. Preparedness is how we get ready with our individual disaster kits and plans and that kind of stuff for responding. Response is once a disaster happens, how we immediately go into, primarily here we're concerned with saving lives. Also property if possible, but really lives, right? So going and making sure if someone's hurt, we're getting that person to medical care, getting them hydrated, that kind of stuff. And then once we've secured the helping the people out that are alive, then we go into working on getting the people that passed away, cleaning up the debris, all that kind of stuff, and we refer to that as the recovery process. So physically improving, physically cleaning up and responding to that impact. And then once we wrap that, then we pivot back into mitigation. So this is an ongoing thing going on all the time. And we just said all that. Again, our major actors in the U.S. are the Federal Emergency Management Agency, codified in the 70s by President Carter's administration, and then all other administrations since then. We have the equivalent at the state level, and then local governments are also involved. Some are much more prepared than our others. And then we have local groups. So I did a creek walk for some folks up in Thousand Oaks this weekend, and they had a DART planning booth there at the sort of festival party thing they had going on, which is disaster preparedness for the local community. So that's an example of hyper-local. So that's folks that want to get trained in their community to know how to respond if there's a disaster, how they can help out, what they might do, that kind of stuff. And then we have a whole network of volunteers. Some of them are faith-based, some of them are not faith-based. Some of them have a very specific disaster they work on, like wildfire prevention. Others have a very broad umbrella, like the Red Cross or whatever, that respond to just about anything, or Shelter Box or something like that in Santa Barbara that works around. And so all these, in a really planned, really well-oiled machine, all these levels work together, right? So rarely, if ever, do we have just one of these levels. And indeed, if we have just one of these levels, that's probably a sign that something is not working well with the disaster response. Then we talked about this. Okay, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. Okay, and then we also mentioned that, and so that's sort of the technical, the kind of professional people that get a career in this would talk about this, but it's also important to remember, as we've seen at various points throughout the semester, that there's a huge emotional component and a huge psychological and personal toll that happens to people that are experiencing disasters. And while it can vary a little bit, I like this chart, which sort of walks us through the broad aspect of it, which is before the disaster, we're kind of in our own headspace, in our own personal space, wherever we are, and we'll generally call that sort of in the middle, just for sake of argument. and then we have the impact, and then usually there's a huge swell of support when everybody has that adrenaline and, oh my God, everybody's so great, and why can't we all, it's like the same thing people say at Christmas time, why can't we all be nice to each other all year round, right? Why can't everything be like Christmas, right? That kind of stuff. And so there's just all this like, oh yeah, helping each other out, coming together. That is the norm. There are places where people are jerks to each other and every person for themselves, but that is the rarity. That is the rarity. It's almost always everybody pulls together in these situations, even if they weren't really a really tight community before the event. And then we sort of get to the end of the honeymoon period, and so then people get to the disaster shelters. They've been there for a couple days, or that kind of stuff, and then the magnitude of the impact starts to wear on them, as you guys have seen throughout the semester, and then we start to go to low levels, right? Then your psychic energy, your soul, your battery needs to be recharged and all that kind of stuff. And then we tend to kind of go through this up and down phase as you kind of make a little bit of progress and, oh my God, I guess I am going to get my insurance check. And then you go to get it and they're like, yeah, here it's like 10% of what you thought it was. And then you kind of crash back down. So this kind of very up-downy recovery. And the point is it takes some long amount of time to get back, in many cases, back to your feeling or your personal state pre-disaster. And the last one to say here is just that there are many setbacks or many triggering events that, you go to the doctors, or it's time for your kid to go back to school and you try to register them and you find out the school isn't open, or, all these different things, some news story on the anniversary, something like that. So that's a very real and important part of disasters, which we used to not really pay much attention to. Now we're much more aware of this, and people are trying to address these things. And we just ran through some examples of that. And then we also mentioned early on in the semester, and I think you've seen throughout as we've been doing the readings and that kind of stuff, this idea that we have some groups in our society that are more vulnerable than are others to a disaster. And while the specific disaster and specific vulnerability will vary, so for example, if we're talking about a respiratory pandemic, that's going to be the people that are smokers or have asthma or some other respiratory disease. They're going to be in this group. But in general, for most cases, it's usually going to be older folks. It's usually going to be folks that have some type of handicap, in particular physical handicaps, but also mentally handicapped folks also have some challenges. Generally speaking, people without a lot of financial means don't have the ability to get out of harm's way, or when you are displaced, don't have resources to rent a hotel room or those types of things, or to rebuild. And then in the context of the US, it would also be folks that can't easily interact with the information systems. And so non-English speakers is the classic example, but it could be other folks, and these things all interact. So that's not to say the whole response has to be designed around just elderly folks or just poor folks, but it does mean that now we take very specific precautions to try to make sure once we have our plan to go back and look and say, hey, okay, cool. Here's the general plan. Great. Now, are we going to capture all of our different subgroups, right? Are we going to be able to address those? And if not, we need to add either modify the overall plan or add some additional capacity to make sure that we can get those folks safe and have those folks protected, et cetera. Okay, and then I think the last major introductory thing we talked about in our class were some of the myths, and we did an exercise on this, right? But the idea that, and I just want to circle back to those before we go on to the next thing, is that this idea that, oh my God, the world ends and everybody screams and runs and stabs each other and just runs and steals televisions and whatever the people say, that virtually never happens, right? There's always a possibility of some of that happening, but that is very rare. And it's always mass chaos? No. I mean, maybe when the bricks are falling off of the building, maybe people are screaming in panic and running. But once that shaking, for example, stops, it is not chaotic as some of the movies and some of the storylines tend to portray, and some of the news coverage sometimes portrays. Again, as I said before, this myth that the disaster brings out the worst in us, it usually brings out some of the best in us, our nurturing, our family tendencies, our working together, our putting aside grudges. That stuff usually is how it plays out. We still love our myth of the Han Solo flowing in, or the John Wayne, or whatever the analogy is, right? Flowing in from the outside, and the one hero that saved us all, right? There are heroic actors. I don't mean to imply that people aren't doing heroic things, but oftentimes that's how the story is spun up. Oh, thank God this person did what they did, and because then they saved 100 people or something like that. The reverse is also the case. Sometimes we get the bad guy. Oh, this one person built that building not to standards, and that's why the whole thing would happen poorly, right? If we have a well-designed system, we shouldn't need a lone hero, and we also shouldn't to help everybody. And we also shouldn't need, or one bad guy shouldn't be capable of wreaking huge havoc, right? So that's our responsibility as disaster professionals, to make sure that we have a system that is supportive and a system that is robust, and you don't need to have those kinds of myths perpetuated. There's also the common myth that survivors are like, oh my God, I'm just sitting here waiting for a handout. And certain media love to run that narrative. Very rarely is that the case. Most folks that did survive a disaster are trying themselves to rebuild. They might need additional resources, but they are mostly trying to work and have agency and do what they can do. And they don't usually just sit around and wait for aid, as some would have you believe. Post-disaster epidemics are inevitable? No. Where they do happen, particularly waterborne diseases and things of that nature, particularly in countries that don't have really robust sewage infrastructure and things like that. But just because that tends to happen more in settings like that does not mean it's inevitable. Does not mean it's inevitable. If we lobby our resources, we can help our brothers and sisters, no matter where they are, avoid these epidemics, right? Epidemics don't start in an hour or a minute. They take time to build. And then so time is also a big myth here, that things are going to get back to normal. You hear this with the Palisades fire. You hear this with the Thomas fire. You hear this with all this. Oh yeah, we're going to rebuild, and pretty soon we'll be back to normal, right? As we saw, for example, in our wildfire recovery module, right? Really, really fast rebuilding someone's house, or if a community's lost many houses, maybe 2.5 years, right? And more like 5 years-ish is more the norm across the U.S., where we have a significant fraction of those houses or those structures being rebuilt. So it does take some time. And then another one is that the goal should always be to put things back the way they were before. So our class this summer on rebuilding in Altadena and the Pacific Palisades will be, unfortunately, a fantastic test of this, right? So you have a community that is relatively very wealthy, very politically powerful, and you have a community that is historically more modest income, historically more traditionally marginalized populations, generally not plugged into the power structures of Los Angeles or Southern California or the state of California or wherever you want to use. And so more or less the same magnitude of impact happened to both these communities. And you hear one of them saying, yep, we're building back right the way we are, right before, right? We're going to suspend the Coastal Act, we're going to do all this stuff, and we're going to right the way we were before. One of the reasons we had some of the problems we did, Gesundheit, in places like the Palisades, is because those roads are from 1923 and 1930 and times like that, way too narrow to get, for example, a modern fire truck easily up the street when there's cars parked on both sides and things of that nature. This notion that the best thing to do is to put everything back exactly the way it was, or effectively exactly the way it was beforehand, that doesn't make much sense, right? I understand people want to get back in their homes. That's understandable. But to build back the same way is only going to perpetuate the vulnerability. Okay, I think that's what I want to say. Yeah, a couple others, I guess. There's lots of fraud. There's always fraud, but there isn't necessarily more fraud in a disaster context than in other times. You'll hear a lot of conspiracy theories. You will hear a lot that outsiders are coming in to buy up property. That's very, very common. That definitely happens, but the notion that people are out to eliminate a community or something is rarely the case. It has happened, it does happen, but yeah, okay, I'll just say that. And then another big one, no one knew. Who could have predicted that a wildfire would hit Southern California? Who could have predicted that a hurricane would hit Louisiana? Who could have? Of course we did, and everybody did beforehand, right? So just because people didn't listen or didn't choose to heed those warnings doesn't mean that no one knew. And you'll hear this a lot from leadership that are looking to sort of escape blame, right? Either implicitly or explicitly. And then the last one here I just have is that insurance is going to make us whole. Insurance will not make you whole. So if your business burned, it might help you tremendously to recover. If you lost your house, it might help you tremendously recover. But for the most part, things get more and more expensive to build as we go through time. And most people do not pay or do not update their insurance to cover the complete cost, the complete modern cost of repairing that infrastructure going forward. Cool. Were there other myths you guys that we talked about, or other ones you saw as we were doing our readings and scoop its and stuff this semester? Were there any other ones in addition to the ones we just talked about that sort of struck you or you seem to see, more than once?